In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the HTTP package for Flutter in order to make API calls. This is the simple app we're going to build, where we have a load users button. When we click on this, we're going to load the users from an API and we're going to display them as such very simply with the name and the email. And as you can see, this is already a list of different users. Let's get started. As mentioned, we're going to use the HTTP package. So just click on this to copy it to your clipboard. Then go to your pubspec.yaml file and under your dependencies, just paste the HTTP package in there and then run pubget. That's all we need to do for the setup. Now concerning the app itself, as you can see here, this is just a simple column where we have a button, then some padding, and then underneath it a list view of users. And for the list view, we're going to use a builder. Make sure that you have the never scrollable scroll physics for the list view, since we already have a scroll view as a parent widget. Also make sure that it's shrink wrap to true, otherwise you will have problems with the layout. Then give the list view an item count, in this case our users.length. So I defined a custom class goRestUser, which I'm going to explain shortly, but this is simply a list of our users. And then for the item builder, we simply have a row where we have on the left hand side an icon with the size of 50, and right next to the icon we have the text where we have the name, and in a new line we have the email of the user. That's it for the layout. And for a button, whenever we press on this elevated button, we are going to call load all users. In this tutorial, we are going to use two different APIs because I want you to see how to use different APIs, since it's almost the same. But in case one of the APIs is no longer available or the pricing changed somehow later on when you see this, so that you will have no problems working with a different API. So the first API we're going to look at is gorest.co.in. This API is free and we can use it to do GET requests and make POST requests to the API. On this website there are some curl examples. We're going to use the list users, and I'm going to show you also how to use a POST request with create user. Updating a user and deleting a user is also very simple. Now if you don't know what a curl is, that's no problem. This is usually just a simple command line tool where you can execute API requests from your terminal. But to make this simpler for you, if you haven't used the terminal before, we can also use a different website for this, where this website simply does this curl request for us. The website we're going to use for making these curl requests is simply reqbin.com/curl. To use this website, all we have to do is copying, for example, this curl request here, then going to the website, pasting it in here, and then click on run. In this case, the status code is 200, which means for API request that the request was okay. And here we can see the output or the result of our API request. And this is simply a list of users. So it's a list and one item is one user. And this is simply in JSON format. So we have an ID of the number 3658. Then for example, the name is this, for example, and then you can see the email, which gender this user has, and whether this person is active or inactive. Now to do this curl request in Flutter, as mentioned before, just install the HTTP package and then import it like so, where you say at the end as HTTP, so that it's easier to use. I just copied this curl request again so that we can directly have a look at it while we're developing our app. Now as you can see here, this -h stands for header for the curl request, and in this case we're giving the curl request two headers. So that's what we are also going to do for our Flutter app. So I defined a simple map with string as key and another string for value. So in this case the content type like this, and then the content type we're going to use, and then another header for accept, which also looks like this with JSON. Next we need the get API request URL. This is in this case for the users. So just say URI.parse and then paste the URL in here. Next, now we're going to use the HTTP package by simply using await http.get, and then we're going to use our URL, which we defined here. And then we're also going to pass through our headers, and we have to await this HTTP request, since we have to wait from the server for the response, and then we save it in our variable response. Then for our response, we can use different variables. So we have access to the body, to the headers, also to our request. But the first thing we have to do is when we got our response is to check the status code to make sure that everything went well. In this case, the status code should be equal to 200. If this is not the case, then we're simply gonna print out that our request was not successful. Otherwise, if our request was successful, then we can decode the body of our response with json.decode. For this, you also need to import the Dart convert package. Then we have a decoded list of dynamic for the users, but we want to make this more easily accessible for us. So I'm going to show you what I did for custom user. So I defined a class called GoRestUser. Since the API is called GoRest, here I simply defined the ID, name and email. Of course, the user has other variables which we can use, but I wanted to keep this very simple for this tutorial. Then we're going to use a named constructor, so GoRestUser, so our class name dot from JSON, and in here we pass through the JSON, and then we are going to assign from our response the ID to our ID, the name to our name, and the email to our email. If you don't understand what I'm doing here, let's have a quick look at our curl request again. And as you can see here, this is basically a JSON, and we use a map in Flutter, and this is basically the key in our map. So we can simply access this key like a list in Flutter, but instead of giving an index, in this case we're simply going to give through the key, and in this case the key is ID, so it will give us the ID here. So back to our load all users function. Once we have decoded our JSON response, we have to map this dynamic list so that we can convert our list to a list of GoRestUser, and we can do this by calling decoded.map and then converting each item to a GoRestUser from the JSON, and then at the end saying toList, since our users is a list of GoRestUsers. And since we're setting the state, this list view won't be empty anymore, since then the users have been loaded from our API. And as mentioned before, this is how our UI is going to look like, where we have the name and the email of a user. So this function was using the HTTP GET request for our API. But if you wanted to post something onto our API, so basically writing something onto our server, this is very similar. For this, let's say we wanted to create a user, and on the GoRest website, this is the curl request for creating a user. To make this more simple for us, I just copied this to our Flutter code, and as we can see here, we have these two headers. We also have an authorization header. In this case, we need an access token. You can get this access token by logging into this website, but for demonstration purposes, I will save you this part, but they will give you the access token, so you could execute this without a problem once you have the access token. And then we're going to call the post API call and give through the data. So in this case, it's a JSON formatted string where we have the name of the new user, which will be this name, and the gender of the new user, and so on. And to do this API request with our Flutter app, first we have to define our headers. Again, you have to replace this token with your custom token if you want to execute this. The content type and accept headers are both the same from our GET request. Then we're going to define a new user. In this case, I gave it this new user name, gender, email, and status. Then again, we're going to use the URL we've already used in our GET request. And then we're going to say http.post, give through the URL. Then for the body, we're going to use our new user, which is encoded in JSON. And then we are also going to pass through the headers. And once this post request is done, we have a response. And based on this response, we can check the status code. And if the status code equals to 200, everything was successful. So we can just simply print out new user was created or whatever you want to show to your user. Otherwise, if the status code is not 200, then we simply print out create user was not successful. Also, to show you another API, I'll be showing you the so-called board API. So this API is very simple. You simply make a API request, for example, boardapi.com/API/activity, and then it's going to give you a random event for when you're bored. It gives you a suggestion what you could do. For example, in this case, you could learn express.js. You could simply copy this and paste it into your browser here and execute it, and then it's going to show you the JSON response in your browser. Usually it's shown like this. In case of Firefox, I also have this possibility to view the JSON more easily. So in this case, the activity is learn how to write in shorthand. Then it gives you the type, how many participants you need, what's the price, then a link. For example, if you were to learn a new programming language, it would give you the link to where you can learn it from. Then it's also going to give you a key and accessibility. What these different parameters mean are explained in the documentation of the board API. And in case of this board API, you're only able to do GET requests. That's why I have shown you the other API first. But if we wanted to use this board API in our Flutter app, simply again use the URI.parse with the API request to get a random activity. Then we're going to say http.get URL, and then we're going to check for the status code, in this case 200, so 200 again means okay. So if the status code is okay, then we can create a custom object of the board response. I created a custom class for this, which is basically just the different variable names with a very simple constructor. And as you can see, for example here, activity is then decoded JSON from our response body with the key activity. We create this board response object, and then simply we're going to print out the board response. If the response wasn't successful, then we're simply going to print out that it was not successful. Also, one last thing to mention, when you're using the HTTP package, you can use, as we've seen, get, post, read. We can also delete something on our server, or use put or patch, or we could use read bytes to download files from our server. That's it for this tutorial. I hope this helped. Please leave a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them down below, and thanks for watching.